I'm Mark. For those that don't know me, I'm Mark Ormerod, Deputy Vice-Chancellor and Provost, and great pleasure to welcome academic colleagues and Jim's partner here tonight to tonight's inaugural lecture. And the role of inaugural lectures at Keele is probably twofold. Firstly, for the new professor, or in this case a new professor to Keele, to talk about their area of expertise, and secondly, I think, to profile research at Keele and in the discipline, in this case within Keele Management School. So in this evening's lecture, Jim's going to explore how mathematical and statistical techniques have been developed and applied to UK bond prices to provide greater insight into current economic conditions and likely future economic conditions. So clearly highly sort of topical area. So just before I pass over to Jim, just a little bit of biography about Jim. So Jim has a PhD from Warwick University, and his thesis was on the effects of the 1986 Big Bang deregulation of UK financial markets on the UK bond market. In 1989, Jim was appointed to a lectureship at none other than Keele University in financial markets, and that was the Keele's first ever dedicated post in the field of finance. In 1995, Keele lost Jim for a period of time, as you can tell, and where he was asked to manage a research team at the Bank of England that was developing techniques to interpret financial markets, market prices, for use in monetary policy advice, and to improve the pricing of UK government debt issues. After a short while, I think Jim realised that he wanted to pursue more self-directed research and took up a senior research fellowship at Cardiff Business School before then moving to University of Stirling in Scotland in 1998 as Professor of Finance. And in 2003, Jim took up the Lloyds Bank Chair Professor of Finance post at Aston Business School, where he remained until last year when he rejoined Keele after a lengthy absence as Professor in Finance. In terms of Jim's research and his achievements, as already mentioned, spans the field of financial markets and investments. Jim's authored over 60 academic papers in that area, publishing in some of the leading journals in the field. His academic reputation has led him to invitations throughout the world to present his research at leading international conferences, including the American Finance Association and the Royal Economic Society. Jim's also been a visitor at many universities internationally, particularly in the US, and also in the UK, including the Financial Markets Group at London School of Economics and the Isaac Newton Institute of Mathematical Sciences in Cambridge. Jim's won a number of awards, among others the Chicago Board of Trade and Inquire Europe for his research. And also, my introduction has largely been about research, in fact entirely been about research, but Jim's contributions to teaching recognised in 2015 with Senior Fellowship of the Higher Education Academy. So can I therefore formally welcome Jim Steeley, Professor in Finance, and invite him to present his inaugural lecture this evening, Guilty Secrets, the Information Hidden in the Prices of UK Government Bonds. Jim.
Thank you, Mark, for your kind introduction, and may I thank all of you for coming this evening. It's especially good to see you all, and I say that because 2 weeks ago I had an operation on one of my eyes, so I'm really delighted to be able to see anyone at the moment. And especially those of you who've travelled some distance to get here, thank you again for coming. As you've just heard, this is my third professorial post, and as neither of the previous two had inaugural lecture programmes in place at that point I joined, I was beginning to wonder if I'd be able to escape the daunting task of a public lecture. Well, it seems not. With almost 20 years having elapsed since my first appointment, I now have around 3 times as much material to draw upon for tonight's talk. So I do have to warn you that there's a chance that the highlights I've chosen may not quite fit into the allotted 2.5 hours. So, without further delay, let me begin. And as Maria von Trapp probably never actually said, I shall start at the very beginning. and introduce you to gilts. Gilts, or gilt-edged securities, are the UK government's bonds. So what then is a bond? A bond is a financial loan, physically a certificate, that repays a fixed face value, F, at some fixed date in the future and pays periodic interest, so-called coupon payments, denoted C, until and including that fixed maturity date, T. Here, in this diagram, the buyer of the gilt pays the price of the gilt to the issuer, in this example, £93 and a penny per bond. The buyer is then lending this money to the issuer, the UK Debt Management Office, the DMO, which is the agency of the UK government responsible for managing the UK's national debt. The UK government is, therefore, borrowing this money from the buyer of the gilt. This monetary transfer is shown by the blue arrow. In return, a certificate of ownership indicating the coupon interest rate and the maturity of the gilt, 5% and 2 years respectively in this example, is given to the buyer or held in a records office in their name. This is shown by the red arrow. The ownership of the gilt entitles the buyer to the coupon interest and a capital repayment, so-called face value. The first coupon, C1 of £5, which is 5% of the £100 face value per gilt, is received after 1 year, and the second and final coupon, C2, also £5 per gilt, is received along with the face value payment F of £100 per gilt at the maturity date in 2 years' time. And these are shown by the green arrow. I'm often asked by students and occasionally colleagues whether I actually invest in the stock market or the gilt market. Well, here's a picture of a gilt I once owned. There it is. So that's what the certificate looks like. It has the value, it has the details of it in this case. 11% interest. I remember those good days. This one matured in 1991. But this talk's not about me, so, well, maybe it is. So let's move on. Here's how the gilt market stood 1 month ago. I realise it's quite small, but hopefully you can see some of what's on the slide. There are 44 conventional gilts with maturities ranging from August this year, so that's the one in the top left there, to July of 2068, which is this one in the bottom right-hand corner here. Shown alongside their name and their maturity date are their price and their yield, more on the yield later, at the close of business on May 2nd, so just a month ago. You'll notice that some of the gilts are called gilts and some are not. So most of the ones on the right-hand side column are Treasury gilts, but some of the ones on the left have other names such as Treasury stock. Historically, gilts had never actually officially been called gilts. They'd had names like Treasury stock, Treasury loan, Exchequer loan. But on May 13th, 2005, the government announced that they would, after waiting 312 years, call all new gilts issued from that date onwards Treasury gilts. They stressed, though, that this was just a name change and nothing otherwise had altered. So why do governments issue bonds? Well, because they need to borrow. If the money raised in taxes does not meet the spending that they wish to do on defence, education, the NHS, social care, the state pension, transport infrastructure, and so on, plus the interest costs due to borrowing by previous governments, then they need to borrow. Of course, governments do actually have one alternative to taxation and borrowing. It could become self-sufficient, but as most countries now avoid sending their military forces on pillaging missions, it seems like borrowing and taxation are here to stay. So how long has the UK been in debt? Well, the first systematic issues of national debt appear to have been to raise £1.2 million to finance the wars against Louis XIV of France. The government of William III had actually managed to raise £4 million in tax, which was quite an achievement given the levels of administrative corruption at the time. And they did this using, among other things, a poll tax, a tax on land rental income, and a lottery. So there really are no new ideas. In 1694, a group of financiers offered to raise the 1.2 million shortfall in exchange for a charter to form a bank. That bank is now known as the Bank of England. So how big is the gilt market now? Well, it's around £1.5 trillion, which is a lot of pounds, shillings and pence. You can see that the size did fall in the mid to late 80s, which is about there, that range. And also, which was the result of the Lawson boom, and the mid to late 90s of this period here, as both the Conservative and then the Labour government, despite strong backbench opposition during the latter, kept ceilings on public expenditure. And that it has also risen massively as a consequence of needing to support the economy post-financial crisis. So, that's this bit here. But, and I think quite interestingly, between the 2001 election and the collapse of the Northern Rock Bank in 2007, which some have perceived as good times, the total debt level in the UK increased by 60%. That's this portion here. The UK's indebtedness was increasing by 10% per year when, surely, if the economic sun was shining, we should have been fixing the holes in the roof, i.e. paying down our debts. But to put the £1.5 trillion in context, it's around 80% of GDP, annual income. And although this is a popular statistic, it mixes stock and flow data. The debt total is around 1/6 of the UK's net worth. Such a level of a debt-to-equity ratio is modest by corporate standards, where double this might be more usually observed. But debt needs to be serviced, and the debt repayments due in 2018 are £67 billion, which is around half UK spending on health, which in 2017 was £140 billion. What does the repayment schedule look like? Well, pretty awful for the next few years. But there is some respite, it seems. But of course, unless we actually have a booming economy, we will simply be replacing current debt with more future debt that will fill in all those little gaps. This is all interesting and fairly topical given the election to be held shortly. The objective of one party to balance the books by 2025 appearing perhaps somewhat optimistic. But my interest is deeper into the market itself, and in particular, the prices of gilts. So what are the secrets in gilt prices? Well, firstly, a set of fundamental interest rates, known as the term structure of spot interest rates, that have many uses, including for determining the selling price of a new bond, which was especially important when the government was refinancing the banks in the financial crisis, for determining the selling prices of bonds with payoffs that may be defaulted upon, corporate bonds, sovereign bonds of poor countries, for example. Also useful for benchmarking the rates to charge to other kinds of long-term loans, for example, mortgages. Also for providing information to help with what I will call, because I want to maintain the element of surprise, the two old ladies problem. And finally, for forecasting future interest rates. While I've looked a little bit at these applications, my main research focus has been on developing and testing techniques to extract these interest rates that are used for all these different things from the prices of gilts, and that's what I'm going to be mostly talking about this evening. But gilt prices have also another valuable use to tell us how well the gilt market is operating. A better functioning government debt market, which is more enticing to investors, lowers the cost of financing government spending and, ultimately, our tax bills. Here, I've been more directly involved in the applied questions than the technical aspects. Particular research questions that I've addressed in the past and continue to examine, and you heard about this already, was how the market responded to the 1986 deregulation of UK financial markets. But more recently, how did the market respond to becoming a safe haven for international capital during the Asian currency crisis of the late 1990s? And more recently still, and this is ongoing research, how has the market managed to absorb the impacts of being the instrument of quantitative easing? And I hope to have time this evening to give you a flavour of this research. But first, some maths to introduce you to the technical side of my work. The price of a gilt, here denoted P, and its future interest or coupon payment C, and its capital repayment value F, are related by that equation there. So what are the things that I haven't mentioned so far? R1, R2, R3, and so on up to R capital T. Well, they're interest rates. And the set of them is known as the term structure of interest rates because it reflects the different interest rates that apply for different terms, different lengths of time. You'll be familiar with the fact that if you save with a building society for a longer period, you may get a better, higher rate of interest than if you keep your cash on instant access. And so here, we might expect the rates for more distant cash to be different from each other. So to show you that they are indeed interest rates, we need to revisit compound interest calculations that most of us didn't enjoy when we first saw them at school maths lessons. Suppose I were to invest £100 for 2 years at 10% per year. After 1 year, I've earned 10% interest on my £100 investment. That is £10 in interest. If I reinvest this interest, so for the second year, I invest the original £100 plus the £10 interest, I'll get 10% on 110 at the end of second year, which is, of course, is £11. This £11 comprises the second £10 interest payment plus interest on the first year's interest of £1, which is 10% of £10. This is compound interest. So by the end of 2 years, our initial £100 is worth £121. We say that the future value of £100 at here 10% interest is £121. But by a simple mathematical rearrangement, we can also see that if the interest is sure to be paid and the capital sure to be returned, that the total of 121 in 2 years' time is equivalent to £100 today. And we can say that the present value of £121 received in 2 years' time is £100 today. So here is it in future value terms and here in present value terms. Now, if we look again at the bond pricing relation, we can see that it's made up of a set of future payments, and the price of the bond is the total of all these payments converted back into their present values using the term structure of interest rates. So we have a set of present value calculations, each added up to make the bond price. But we know the price of a bond because we see it in the market. And with a bond, we also know its future payments, the coupon interest payments. So the only thing that we don't know here are the set of interest rates. And so perhaps we can use the knowledge of the things we do know to find the things that we don't know. And I've already said that these are very useful interest rates to be able to find. Well, we can extract them from the prices, and I'll show you how it's done shortly. But here's what they looked like in August last year, which was just after the latest drop in the Bank of England's base rate. The shape is still broadly similar now, although the middle range of rates, so around here, is crept up closer to 2, but broadly the shape is the same as it was after the most recent drop in interest rates. So how can we extract these interest rates from our bond prices? Well, let's take a simple example using 2 gilts to find 2 of the rates. Both gilts have exactly 2 years to maturity, pay coupons once per year on the same day for each gilt. One has a coupon of 5% and the other a coupon of 9%. Their relations between their prices and their coupons look like this. So here's the 5% one, and here is the 9% one. So we have their prices on the left, and we have their coupon payments and their face value payments, each one being converted to its present value by one of the interest rates. Now, although it doesn't look immediately like it in the form that it's written here, this is actually just a pair of simultaneous equations, which we all got tortured with in school maths lessons. If we make a simple substitution, whereby we let x be £1 over 1 plus r1 and y be £1 over 1 plus r2 squared, the 2 original bond pricing equations turn into something that looks more like a a simultaneous equation we might have seen in the past, although the numbers are not especially friendly. Nonetheless, we can solve for the values of x and y and then substitute back, and if we do that, we find that the first interest rate for the first set of payments is 8%, and for the second payments is 8.995%. So, you might wonder, is finding these interest rates just as simple as solving simultaneous equations? Fortunately not. I say fortunately because the techniques required instead have provided many interesting research avenues among many different areas of financial markets research that together have kept me busy for over 30 years. So why can't we just solve a system of equations? What is the problem? Well, these 44 bonds that you saw on one of the early slides will make payments on 225 different dates over the next 51 years, which means that we start with 44 prices, but are trying to extract 225 different interest rates. This is what mathematicians call an under-identified system. To find all 225 interest rates, we would need 225 bonds. And these bonds would have to be designed so that they did not add to the number of payment dates. So what is the solution? Well, we have to reduce the dimensions of the problem so that we're trying to find no more than 44 outputs, or parameters as I shall call them, from the 44 bonds. Until 1971, it was industry practice to assume that all the rates for all the dates for any particular bond were all the same for that bond. This reduces the dimension of the problem to dimension 1, but this is extreme and reveals nothing. But because financial markets value their traditions, this composite rate is still calculated. It's called the redemption yield, and you saw it alongside the bond prices in that earlier slide. But it's unique to the bond rather than unique to any payment date, and so it's just a surrogate price, and so tells us no new information. For any of you familiar with derivatives, options and futures, it's like using implied volatility as a surrogate option price. They're different ways of presenting the same information. We saw that the spot interest rates, the blue dots, tended to be higher for longer maturities. So perhaps an upward sloping line would be better. Well, this has dimension 2, which is certainly less than 44, and means that all our 225 interest rate estimates would depend on different combinations of the two parameters here denoted A0 and A1. But as can be seen, the fit to the data is still very poor. Now, the S-shape of the blue dots is very suggestive of a cubic polynomial function of maturity, which has dimension 4. So perhaps we should try that. And if we do, it now means that our 225 interest rates depend on different combinations of 4 parameters. This is better, but clearly still not good enough for pricing new bonds accurately. You can see that it's considerably away from the dots in a number of areas, particularly at the longer maturity ends out here. And so if the government was wanting to issue a new long-term bond and was pricing off this purple curve, then it could make serious errors in pricing its bond. And of course, we want the DMO, the Debt Management Office, to set good prices, because if it sets good prices, then all other things equal, our taxes should be lower. In 1971, Hugh McCulloch, while he was a PhD student at Chicago, published a paper recommending the use of spline functions, which fit separate but connected polynomials in adjacent maturity ranges. For example, different cubic functions for short-term bonds, for medium-term bonds, and for long-term bonds, but making sure that there's a smooth join as you transfer from one region to the next. This, with various subsequent bells and whistles, to use some technical jargon, remains the framework of choice for governments to use to extract spot rate curves for pricing their new bonds. Until around 15 years ago, computer memory was such that spline functions in their standard form, as displayed in the slide, I need to move the slide on one, sorry, suffered from numerical accuracy. So the spline functions is this one up here. Suffered from numerical inaccuracy, which had material consequences for pricing bonds. At that point, computer storage and memory were insufficient for getting accurate bond price values. This was solved, though, by a rearrangement of the form of the splines into what are known as B-splines, first suggested for term structure research by Gary Shea, who was then at the US Federal Reserve, and first applied to the gilt market by me back in the late 80s, early 90s. At the same time, a competing model was being developed by Charles Siegel and Andrew Nelson at the University of Washington in Seattle that recommended using exponential-based functions, and it included a nonlinear parameter. So that's this one here. The nonlinear parameter is the lambda one, the one that looks like an upturned V. In its original form, it has just 4 parameters, A0, A1, A2, and lambda. And so much like the cubic polynomial, does not fit very well. But because the parameters A0, A1, and A2 can be shown to characterize in turn and in broad terms the level, the slope, and the concavity of the term structure, it gained much popularity. And for more macroeconomic applications, such as forecasting interest rates, it remains the dominant method. Moreover, in 2011, Francis Diebold from the University of Pennsylvania, Glenn Rootbush at the Federal Reserve Board, and Jens Christensen at the San Francisco Fed published a theoretical underpinning for this otherwise purely mathematical technique. However, for bond pricing, this model just doesn't have enough parameters. But in 1995, Lars Svensson of the Swedish Central Bank recommended adding an additional concavity term. So, another one of these. However, having 2 very similarly shaped functions and now 2 nonlinear parameters made this notoriously difficult to apply. In the mid-1990s, most central banks were having internal debates, including during my time at the Bank of England, as to whether to extract spot rates using splines, these ones, or using the Svensson model, so this one here with another one of these added on the end. My view was and remains that this Svensson model has too few dimensions and is too problematic to apply. So I was recommending spline functions. Unfortunately for me, Lars Svensson was a friend of Mervyn King, the then chief economist at the bank. And so this was not a debate I was going to win. Actually, the eventual position was that my team at the bank developed a new spline-based model for the Gilt division of the bank, now the Debt Management Office, who priced gilts, and a new Svensson-based model for the Monetary Policy Division, who did the forecasting. The former, though updated, is still being used by the Debt Management Office, while the bank now also use a spline-based technique, having realised, not too long after I left, roughly 20 years ago today, that I was right all along. What, of course, we all missed at the time, or perhaps for various small p political reasons we're choosing to ignore, is that we weren't actually comparing like with like. The Svensson model has 6 parameters, and the spline model could have as many parameters as there were bonds. That's just not a fair fight. A model with more parameters will generally fit better. But this did occur to me around the turn of the millennium, and in the resulting paper, which I published in 2008, I examined a fair fight between the 2 models by adding multiple extra concavity terms to the Nelson-Siegel model. So that's this one here. So you've got not just one extra concavity term, but lots of extra concavity terms. But rather than have the nonlinear parameters as free parameters, they were prefixed. So this model, which you could perhaps call Svensson plus, can be extended to have the same number of parameters as the spline function so that you can compare the 2 fairly. What this showed was that during normal market conditions, so pre the financial crisis, as long as the 2 models have the same number of parameters, they're as good as each other. However, during turbulent times, the crisis, they both struggle, but the Svensson model struggles more. So, as I knew anyway, spline functions are best. So here's a spline function fitted to those blue dots. This one just has 6 parameters, and I think you'll agree it's a lot better than the ones that you've seen so far. Plus, this was my first attempt. I just set the two breakpoints based on kind of where I thought they should be with 30 years of experience, and did not, by contrast to my 2008 paper, set the computer spinning for a few hours to find the optimal points to break the different spline functions. The fit, the R-squared for my economist colleagues in the room, is 99.97%, which is, I think, not bad for a first attempt. Actually, my 2008 paper recommends 7 parameters, either splines or the Svensson plus model, as I call it. But in a more recent paper, I showed that during the crisis, to assume the same level of accuracy for bond pricing required 17 parameters for the splines and 43 for the Svensson model, which actually is almost as many as there are bonds. So clearly the crisis made things more tricky in terms of extracting those blue dots. So there are robust techniques to extract the blue dots, the term structure of interest rates with reasonable accuracy, and this is good because it has lots of useful applications, which I've mentioned already. But these techniques involve fitting a curve, so they also not only identify the blue dots, but they also join the dots together. You can see that the yellow curve actually runs between the dots as well. So they can also provide measurements of interest rates appropriate to future dates upon which no bond actually makes a payment. So for example, we can use this fitted curve to find the interest rate for payments at this point of time in the future, even though there's no bond actually making a payment, by using the value that the curve fitted gives us. So if the Debt Management Office decide to issue bonds with payment dates other than 7th of March, June, September and December, and 22nd of January or 22nd of July, it has access to interest rates to value those future cash flows for setting its new bond prices. Moreover, any other provider of interest rate-based financial products can benchmark their prices. For example, suppose a building society wishes to offer a 5-year savings product. If no government bond currently makes a payment in exactly 5 years' time, there's no market data to directly identify the appropriate interest rate to offer. They have instead to use a rate from the 5-year position on a term structure that's been smoothed, interpolated, between the dates of actual cash flows, likely using some kind of spline technique. In 1997, the government permitted some of their gilts to be what is called stripped into separate cash flow components to be traded separately. For the first time in 300 years, this actually gave direct estimates of the blue dots without the need to fit a curve. But it still didn't remove the need to have access to estimates of the rates between the blue dots, for which the spline functions remain the best choice of technique to find them. One further, and I hope to convince you, important aspect of extracting interest rates from bond prices is that, as in the graph displayed now, the curve is fitted between the shortest and the longest bond. So the shortest term bond being this end, with maturity about now, and the longest one in this particular example being out at about 2025. At present, the longest maturity conventional gilt is the 3.5% Treasury Top 2068. That was the one in the bottom right-hand corner of the table of the gilts that I put up right at the start. And that repays its capital in 51 years' time from now. What that means, of course, is that we actually have no direct market information on how to value cash payments to be made or to be received beyond 2068. For me, this may not matter unless I live well into my 11th decade. But for my sons, the younger of whom will not be 70, his likely retirement age until 2072, this does matter. So a literature in finance that's focused exclusively on fitting a curve in sample is now going to, in my opinion, have to start thinking about fitting that curve out of sample, extrapolation rather than interpolation. Many of you will know that there's a cluster of researchers here at Keele looking at various aspects of the consequences of an aging population. Well, here's the demographic question that's facing the finance profession and that it has, arguably, yet to fully grasp. Because the bond market only goes out as far as 2068, we have no way of putting a value today on the pension liabilities of anyone who will be collecting on their pension in full or in part after 2068. This can also be viewed, remembering the equivalence between present values and future values, as an admission that there's no financial market-based guidance on how much we need to save now to meet any desired level of pension income where that is going to be received after 2068. But of course, as we move forward into the future, new bonds will be issued to keep the horizon to probably at least 51 years. So provided no one is collecting on their pension for more than 51 years, everything is fine. But that then begs the question, just how long do pension liabilities last? Meet Gertrude and Alberta, the two old ladies I mentioned at the beginning. Gertrude Grubb was born in Blaine, Tennessee in 1909. She married John Janeway in 1927 when she was 18 and he 81. He had been an officer in the 14th Illinois Cavalry, which was on the Union side of the American Civil War. At the time, many of John's friends were alarmed by the age difference. In fact, his doctor advised him that marrying a woman 63 years younger than him could be fatal, to which he is reported to have replied, well, if she dies, she dies. Well, he died first, aged 91 in 1937. However, she received a $70 pension check for veterans' benefits from the US government every 2 months until her death in 2003. Alberta Stewart, on the left, was born in Danley's Crossroads, Alabama in 1906. At 18, she met a cab driver named Howard Farrow, and they had a son. But Howard died in a car accident in 1926. She relocated where she met a widower, William Jasper Martin, who was born in 1845 and was a veteran of the 4th Alabama Infantry, a Confederate unit during the Civil War. On December 10, 1927, the then 21-year-old Alberta Stewart married the 81-year-old Martin, primarily to get help raising her son, and because his $50 per month Confederate pension check guaranteed her a degree of financial security. William Martin died in 1931. However, Alberta continued to receive her Confederate widow's pension until her death in 2004. In both these cases, the amounts were modest, but these pension entitlements spanned 3 centuries, lasting around 140 years, illustrating just how long pension commitments can last. So, is a bond market with a maximum maturity of 2068 adequate? Possibly not, but interestingly and perhaps surprisingly, the most recent Debt Management Office consultation in 2012 effectively kicked further discussion of ultra-long maturity gilt issuance into the long grass. So, what can be done? If we wish to value ultra-long-term cash flows, we need to extrapolate the term structure beyond the limits of data. I'll go back one. Essentially, we need to know what happens to the curve as we go further into the future. Luckily, there's some theoretical guidance in the form of economic models of how the term structure can move through time. And these have implications, though not very well developed, because the long end of the curve has just not been interesting to researchers for the shape of the curve as maturity increases. This is an area of research that I plan to tackle in the future, building on some work I published in 2014, which looked at the shape properties of the recently developed theoretical model of the term structure, that of Diebold, Roodbush, and Christensen that I mentioned earlier. They were treating certain parameters of the model as a nuisance, whereas I could see, and they missed, or more likely just weren't interested, that these represented shape characteristics. So I'd like to see what these nuisance shape components imply for the term structure, say, out to 150 years. But that's literally a future project. How am I on time? Okay, I'll carry on. Okay. So now I'd like to tell you about another application of the term structure of interest rates, and that's for forecasting future interest rates. The shape of the blue dots tells us today that we put different values on cash received in more distant time than we do in the nearer term future, even after accounting for time, which would simply imply a flat line. So it is reasonable to wonder whether the shape we see conveys any information about the future path of this very curve, or indeed any points on this curve. For example, will the shortest maturity blue dot, the one to the furthest left here, simply in future just track along this curve, or not? In fact, is it sensible to expect this even? Is the shape really completely uninformative? Well, it turns out that the shape that we see there is informative, but to extract that information, we have to impose an economic model, which, even at its least invasive, means making some assumptions. Imagine you wish to invest with your building society for 2 years. It offers you a deal of 6% interest per year, so 12% over 2 years, ignoring compounding. But you see another building society will offer you 7% for 1 year, but it has no 2-year product, but anticipates offering a new 1-year product in 1 year's time. Which do you choose? Well, clearly, if in 1 year's time from now the other building society was able to offer you anything better than 5%, you'd have been better off putting your money in the other building society, and of course vice versa. Now, suppose we lived in a world where the future was completely certain, and as academics, such thought experiments are common, which means that you'd already know today what rate the other building society was going to offer next year. If they offered anything other than 5%, either everyone would switch to your building society or everyone would switch to the other building society. So for both of them to continue offering these kinds of products, they'd both have to offer the same deal across 2 years, whether it was constructed from a 2-year product or 2 1-year products. So the rate that would, after the fact, equalise the investments in the uncertain world is actually what it would have to be were the world certain. And this rate has a name. It's called the implied forward rate, and here it is 5%. In the 1930s, several economists who were exploring interest rate behaviour suggested that it would be reasonable to expect the rate that will occur in the future to be the one that would have to occur, assuming the world was certain. In other words, our best guess of the rate in 1 year's time is today's implied forward rate for that subsequent year. This clearly generates a very simple means to forecast interest rates, and this is still a very pervasive rule of thumb in the markets and among economists. But it was also quickly recognised that 5% for certain in the certain world is not the same as 5% expected to happen in the real world. So investing in 2 1-year deals is risky, whereas the single 2-year deal is not. So the implied forward rate must also contain some kind of reward for bearing risk, which means that the interest rate you'd be expecting will be less than the forward rate. But how much less? Well, that question was largely sidestepped by macroeconomic researchers until the 1990s, when their models began to formally include measures of risk. Between the 1960s and 1980s, macroeconomic models regularly invoked an assumption of perfect foresight, so-called rational expectations, which enabled them to replace forecasts with the values that would have to have obtained under certainty. However, in the finance literature, responding to developments in the pricing of derivative securities that had enjoyed a later Nobel-winning breakthrough in 1973, researchers began to formally incorporate risk into models of the term structure of interest rates, the first 2 models being published in 1977 and 1985. These models, though, are highly complex and got even more so during the 1990s and 2000s. The breakthrough, though, for interest rate forecasting came with the work of econometricians Diebold and friends in 2011, I mentioned them earlier, who were able to place a relatively simple and easily interpretable model of the term structure, the exponential Nelson-Siegel model that we saw a few slides back, into the highly complex theoretical models that financial mathematicians have been developing in the 2000s. These are proving to be useful models for interest rate forecasting, and indeed I applied them to the UK term structure in a paper published in 2014. And they certainly appear much better than just using forward rates, meaning that adjusting for risk is important. Now, I spent a considerable time exploring the interest rates that can be revealed by bond prices, but what about the prices themselves? I have mentioned already a number of areas where they can provide information, and now I'd like to tell you a little bit about this area of research. You will have heard of quantitative easing, which is what monetary policy makers have to do when they can no longer boost the economy by reducing interest rates. It is the purchase of financial securities from the banking sector, the corporate sector, financial markets and individuals, which is financed by the electronic creation of money at the central bank. Japan was the first country in recent times to do this between 2001 and 2006, although they recommenced in 2013. But both the UK and the US started quantitative easing programs as the financial crisis took hold at the turn of 2008-2009. In the UK, the Bank of England mostly bought gilts, a lot of them, around £375 billion worth. I should explain this Box-and-Whisker plot. The left-hand box is for the first period of QE, the middle box is for the period between the first and second periods of QE, and the right-hand box is for the second and third periods of QE. The vertical axis measures the proportion of a gilt that's owned by the Bank of England at the end of that period. The midline of the box is at the level of the median average across the gilts. The top of the box is at a level where 25% of the bonds had a Bank of England ownership share higher than this level. The bottom of the box has 25% of the bonds below this level. So the box contains the middle 50%. The top and bottom of the whiskers, that's these little antennae things, give an idea of the highest and lowest ownership shares that were taken in by the Bank of England. So as a result of quantitative easing, the Bank of England's median ownership stake in any gilt is around 30%. And for some gilts, they own more than 60% of outstanding stock. In fact, it was fairly recently that they actually made a commitment not to buy more than 70% of any stock. And of course, they've done this by just creating money, by just adding zeros to their own bank balances. And they're getting paid the coupon interest on a regular basis to this, which means that my very small Bank of England pension is very secure. The gilt market is the stock market. So the fact that they own 60% of an outstanding stock of a gilt, does this matter? Well, the gilt market is the stock market for gilts, where investors can trade their gilts, sell if they need the cash, or buy to invest cash, without having to wait for new debt sales. It provides investors with immediate investment opportunity and immediate liquidity. The latter encourages investors to buy new gilts because they know they can always sell them on if they so wish. So what does removing 30% of the stock of debt, or in fact in some cases 60% of the stock of debt, do to this market? Well, to answer this question, we need a means to measure how well financial markets are working. There are two main methods of measuring how well financial markets are working: operational efficiency and informational efficiency. Operational efficiency concerns the costs associated with trading in the market. Let me use the example of getting your holiday foreign currency. You will notice that there's always a difference between the buying and selling price for your currency. You have to buy high and sell low. This difference is the fee that the provider of currency, who is exposed to fluctuations in the value of their inventory, earns. This spread exists in other financial markets, and the smaller it is, the cheaper it is to trade, and so the better the market is functioning. Other costs that you might face include fees you might need to pay to brokers or other intermediaries, or perhaps even the spread changes as you try to do different sizes of trades. Information efficiency, on the other hand, refers to the extent to which prices of financial assets correctly reflect the value of their future cash flows. More on this later if we have time. Oh, that was the one. Here's what happened to the spread in the gilt market during QE. You might have expected that removing 30% of something makes it harder and so more expensive to buy or sell. But as shown in a paper I published in 2015, the spread decreased during the phases of QE. From this level on average to these kinds of levels on average. Why? This seems potentially surprising. Well, the reason is that at the same time that the Bank of England was busy buying lots of gilts, so also the Debt Management Office was very busy issuing new gilts to recapitalise the banking sector in the aftermath of the financial crisis. And you can see that here. The gilt sales by the Debt Management Office are in blue, and the gilt purchases by the Bank of England are in green. And you can see that the number of purchases in blue is easily able to cope with the number of, the sales in blue easily accommodate the purchases in green. And in fact, that additional activity led to the reduction in spreads, as there was much more activity, so those who were running the market didn't need to make so much profit per trade. QE also had an impact on the informational efficiency of the gilt market. We describe a market as being informationally efficient if the price fully reflects all the information that's known about and is relevant to the financial security. If this is so, the price of the security will clearly reflect its true value, in particular, the present value of its future cash flows. How can we tell if this is so? Well, as is common in scientific method, we search for evidence of the converse. In this case, we look for evidence of inefficiencies. So what are the symptoms of informational inefficiency? Suppose that a new piece of information is released or some economic information becomes relevant for a financial security's value, but that the price did not immediately reflect this. Until the new information has been fully incorporated into the price will be incorrect. Let's suppose that the information takes 2 or 3 days to filter into the price. This means that over those few days, the price movements of the security will all be responding to the same piece of information. This same underlying causal factor will generate a correlation between successive price moves, for example, between the daily price changes over 2 or 3 days. This correlation can be identified using standard statistical techniques for measuring correlation in data. Maurice Kendall, a 20th-century statistician, published a paper in 1953 in which he expressed great disappointment in not being able to find correlations in financial price changes, the like of which he had found extensively in economic data, and which were due to what seemed like the inevitable cycles that economists seem to experience. What was not appreciated for a further 10 years was that he had discovered that most of the time financial markets do in fact reflect most relevant information in a timely fashion. But at times, the efficiency of the market can be disturbed, and I've observed the gilt market periodically over the last 30 years to see whether key events have disrupted or improved the level of information efficiency. In my PhD, I examined the effects of the 1986 deregulation, where the market changed beyond all recognition. Before then, all trading was done through just 2 market-making companies, whereas afterwards there were 31 such companies. Moreover, the fee structure had been laid down by the stock exchange and was then opened up to negotiation, and brokers could change gilts between clients without going to market. As might be expected, the impact on efficiency with such a boost to competition was immediate and significant, with significant reductions in correlations across price changes. The market experienced its next major set of reorganizations around 1997-98, with the introduction of strips and changes to issuance procedures, and at the same time became a haven for international capital due to the Asian currency crisis, which saw massive devaluations of a number of Asian currencies. This time it was the increased volume that led to improvements in information efficiency. More recently, as already been seen, the market became the main instrument of quantitative easing. The Bank of England bought £375 billion worth of gilts. The increase in activity around the QE period also reduced the correlation between successive price movements, and that's in this slide here, as you can see. During phases of QE, the correlations between successive price movements were much reduced. So QE, perhaps also along with increased issuance of debt, has been of benefit to the gilt market, and that, all else being equal, puts much welcome downward pressure on our tax bills. This has, I hope, given you a flavour of the kind of research that I do, and by introducing you to Gertrude and Alberta, given you some indication of where I think the field of finance needs to think about in future. I'm often asked, why did I get into gilts in the first place rather than shares, which was certainly where all the research action was in the 1980s when I was a lone researcher in gilts? Well, I leave you with the words of one Andrew Mellon, former US Secretary of State and Ambassador to Britain. Gentlemen prefer bonds. Thank you very much.